Inside the golden palaces of the Ottoman Empire, beauty was both a blessing and a curse. A single look from the sultan could raise a slave girl to power or condemn her to disappear without a trace. The story begins where few dared to look behind the silken curtains of the Topkapi Palace. To the world, it was a paradise of luxury, marble halls echoing with the music of flutes, courtyards filled with perfume and laughter. But those who lived inside knew the truth. This was no paradise. It was a gilded cage. The Ottoman harem wasn't merely a place of pleasure. It was a system, an empire within an empire, where every woman's value was measured in obedience, silence, and youth. Here, thousands of women from across continents were trained, tested, and judged. Some would rise to unimaginable influence, mothers of princes, advisors of kings. Others would vanish in the night, their names erased from every record. They called it the purification of the court. To the sultan, a discarded concubine wasn't a woman. She was a political threat, a rumor waiting to spread, a memory that could not be allowed to survive. And so, her story ended not with screams, but with silence. Imagine the fear that lived inside those walls. Every smile could be the last. Every gift from the sultan could be a farewell in disguise. No one knew which night the guards would arrive, soft-footed, carrying a silk cord or a sealed letter. The next morning, her room would be empty, her name removed from the harem rolls. To the palace, she never existed. To history, she was a ghost. But who were these women really? How did they rise, and what exactly happened when they fell? Were they killed, exiled, sold again into new lives under false names? Or were they hidden somewhere deep in the labyrinth of the palace, locked away so the sultan's secret would remain untouched? Tonight, we open that forbidden chapter. The walls of Topkapi still hold their whispers, the stories of jealousy, betrayal, and vengeance disguised as royal order. What the Ottoman sultans did to the women they no longer desired was never written in their chronicles. But the shadows, remember. Welcome to the most horrific things Ottoman sultans did to discarded concubines. A journey through a history wrapped in gold and blood, where beauty bought survival and love could mean death. Stay till the end, because the truth that emerges from these forgotten halls will change how you see power, cruelty, and the empire that ruled half the world. The Ottoman harem was not a place of romance, it was a machine of empire. Hidden deep inside the walls of the Topkapi Palace, it was guarded more tightly than the royal treasury. Only a handful of men ever entered. The sultan himself, his sons, and the black eunuchs castrated servants sworn to eternal silence. Inside those corridors lived hundreds, sometimes thousands, of women. They came from every corner of the empire, from the mountains of the Caucasus, the villages of the Balkans, and the markets of North Africa. Most were taken as slaves in war, or bought from merchants. But once they passed through the gates, they ceased to be captives. They became part of a new identity, the sultan's household, bound by sacred law and deadly discipline. Each girl was given a new name. Her past, her family, her language, even her faith, was stripped away. She was dressed in silk, trained in etiquette, music, and dance. She learned the language of the palace, Ottoman, Turkish, and the subtle politics of survival. Every glance, every movement, every breath had to obey the rhythm of the harem. They were divided by rank, a hierarchy sharper than any blade. At the bottom were the Assimi girls, the novices. Above them, the Gaidakli, the trained attendants. Then came the Iqbals, the favorites, those who had once caught the sultan's eye. Higher still stood the Khaden, the official consorts, each one with her own apartment, servants, and guards. And above all of them, the valid sultan, the mother of the reigning sultan, whose word could rival even his own. Power in the harem was invisible but absolute. It did not rest in titles, but in access. Who could whisper in the sultan's ear? Who could influence his moods, his meals, or his dreams? One wrong word, one jealous glance, one servant's rumor, and a woman's entire world could collapse overnight. There was no court, no defense, no second chance. The sultan's will was divine law, but behind the shimmering curtains there was another kind of struggle, quiet, patient, and merciless. Women formed alliances like kingdoms, each circle spying on the next. Jewels, poetry, and smiles were weapons. A misplaced perfume, a forged letter, or a whispered accusation could destroy a rival. The walls themselves seemed to listen. Every night, the palace musicians played to mask the sound of footsteps because everyone knew that some nights, a woman would simply vanish. The system was built on perfection, and perfection was impossible. The younger concubines were trained to please, to entertain, to charm. But once their youth began to fade, or once the sultan's attention wandered to another, their value declined. They were moved to smaller quarters. Their jewelry was taken away, their attendants reassigned. In the eyes of the palace, they were discarded, though they still lived within the same walls. And here lay the horror, because the discarded were not free to leave. They knew too much, secrets of state, of bloodlines, of royal habits and betrayals. They were living archives of the empire's private sins, and so, the empire found ways to make them disappear quietly. Some were sent to remote palaces, Under the name of retirement, others were married off to distant governors, their new husbands warned never to ask about their past. A few were allowed to live under watch in religious houses, spending the rest of their days praying for forgiveness for sins that weren't their own. But for many, the end came quietly, without witnesses. Beneath the shadow of the crescent moon, the harem system promised safety, luxury, and belonging, but at its core, it was a battlefield. A war not fought with swords, but with silence. Every concubine knew she was both precious and disposable. She existed only as long as she was desired, and when that desire ended, so did her story. The harem was the empire's most guarded secret, but even in its silence, it left traces, letters, rumors, fragments of poetry smuggled out by servants, each one hinting at the fear that ruled those golden chambers. And from these whispers, a darker picture emerges, because when the sultan turned away from a woman he once called beloved, the empire turned against her too. For every woman in the sultan's palace, power was measured not in gold or titles, but in attention. The sultan's gaze was life itself, a silent sun that made one woman bloom while another wilted in the shadows. And just as swiftly as it rose, that sun could disappear behind a veil of indifference. When a concubine was chosen by the sultan, her life changed overnight. Her room moved closer to his chambers. Her clothes were replaced with silks embroidered in gold thread. Servants bowed to her. Her name whispered through the halls like perfume. The palace poets composed verses about her beauty, and every rival, every jealous eye, watched her rise and silently counted her days. Because everyone knew, the higher she climbed, the further she could fall. The fall rarely came with warning. Sometimes, it was as simple as a new face arriving in the harem, a younger girl from Circassia or Greece, her skin untouched by the sun, her laughter still innocent. Sometimes, it was politics, the valid sultan disapproving of her influence, or a vizier whispering that she had grown too ambitious. And sometimes, it was nothing at all, just boredom, a sultan's tired sigh after dinner. And suddenly, a woman's world was over. At first, the change was subtle. Her invitations to the sultan's chamber became less frequent. Her jewelry remained untouched for days. The servants assigned to her began to vanish, one by one, reassigned to new favorites. Even her food changed. Smaller portions, colder dishes, delayed service. It wasn't punishment. It was erasure. The walls that once echoed her laughter grew silent. She still lived inside the palace, but the palace no longer saw her. Women who used to flatter her now walked past without bowing. Her old allies avoided her gaze, as if her misfortune were contagious. Even the eunuchs began to treat her differently, their politeness mechanical, their smiles gone. Every discarded concubine went through this stage, invisibility. The palace made her feel dead long before she was. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into dread. Every footstep outside her door made her flinch. Every candle that burned low seemed like a countdown. Some tried to win their place back. They sent gifts to the valid sultan, gold, perfumes, even poems written in tears. They tried to summon memories of the sultan's affection, wearing the same dress, singing the same song, hoping he would remember. But the palace had no mercy for those who begged. A forgotten woman was a dangerous one, because a forgotten woman remembered too much, and what she remembered could destroy empires. There were stories whispered through the servants' quarters of women who tried to escape. One tried to flee disguised as a maid. Another wrote a letter to a foreign ambassador, pleading for rescue. Their stories all ended the same way, silence. Their names erased from the registers, their rooms cleaned by dawn. The official record said they relocated, but no one ever saw them again. By the time the final stage came, the order the woman had already lost everything that made her human. Her hair would be cut, her ornaments taken. Sometimes she was told she was being transferred to another palace, given a small chest of coins, and led away by guards in the night. Few ever reached their destination. The Ottoman court called this disposal by discretion, a phrase so gentle, it sounded merciful. But everyone in the palace knew what it meant. It meant her time was over, and her memory soon would be too. There were some sultans who handled these things personally, with cold detachment. Others left it to their mother, the valid sultan, or to the chief eunuch, the silent executioner of royal secrets. In every case, the message was the same. No one leaves the palace knowing what the sultan's heart once held. And so, in the dead of night, the corridors echoed softly, the faint rustle of silk, the slow steps of men who spoke no words. Then silence again. By morning, her room would be empty, her portrait removed, her name scratched out from the records as if she had never existed. The rest of the harem would continue as if nothing happened. Music would play, perfume would drift through the courtyards, the sultan would smile upon another girl, and life, or what passed for it, would resume. But in the hearts of those who remained, the fear deepened. Every vanished woman was a warning. Every smile could be a lie. And the longer one survived, the more one realized. In the Ottoman harem, death wasn't the greatest punishment, being forgotten was. And so the empire moved on with its gold, its conquests, its prayers, built upon the silence of those who once had names, faces, and dreams. And those silences still echo. Two outsiders. The harem was a place of beauty, a house of music, art, and refinement. But those who lived inside knew that everything in the palace had a procedure, even disappearance. Nothing in Topkapi happened without record, without ritual, without a reason carefully disguised in words. When a concubine lost favor, her fate was sealed in a document, a single folded parchment, sealed with wax, marked with the sultan cipher. It never said execution, it never said death. It said something else: transfer, retirement, or marriage. Words that sounded gentle. But inside the harem, everyone understood what they really meant, because here, mercy was written in euphemisms. The most common method was retirement. The official story claimed that older or unwanted concubines were allowed to live quietly in smaller palaces, outside Istanbul and Edirne, or Manisa. They were given servants, an allowance, and orders never to return. But few ever reached these distant homes. Their journeys were silent, their records brief, their deaths unmarked. Only the eunuchs who escorted them knew what really happened on the road. And those eunuchs were loyal to one thing alone: the sultan's silence. For those the empire chose to marry off, the illusion was even more perfect. The sultan would reward a trusted officer, pasha, or governor with a bride of royal favor. In truth, it was exile in disguise. The husband was instructed to treat her with respect, but also to keep her away from the capital, and never to speak her name in public. To the world, she was a symbol of the sultan's generosity. To the woman herself, she was a ghost with a heartbeat. Some of these women lived quietly for years, growing old in distant provinces, forever watched by imperial agents. They were the lucky ones. They could breathe, at least, but they could never write home, never return, never tell the truth about where they came from. The empire feared nothing more than memory. The most mysterious disappearances happened within the palace itself. In the night, a few guards, often eunuchs, would appear at a woman's chamber. She would be told she was being relocated. No one screamed. No one resisted. The silence of centuries weighed too heavy on those walls for anyone to fight it. By dawn, her room was empty, her bed made, her belongings distributed to others. By the next morning, even the servants who had known her were reassigned. The palace erased her like a page wiped clean. The harem kept its secrets buried under ritual and repetition. Every disappearance was followed by purification. Servants would burn incense in the empty room, wash the floors with rosewater, and hang new curtains. It was as if the woman never existed, as if her memory had been cursed. To speak her name was considered unlucky. And so, slowly, the women who remained learned to unlearn the faces of those who vanished. Historians later found fragments, coded entries in royal ledgers, sudden name changes, unexplained allowances that stopped mid. Letters from Venetian and Persian ambassadors hinted at these vanishings, but never dared to say more. Even foreign spies were afraid to ask what happened behind those marble doors. Some whisper that certain discarded concubines were sent to remote convents or religious houses, places where women lived under vows of silence. It was a convenient lie, one that soothed the conscience of the empire. But the truth was far simpler and far colder. The Ottoman court could not afford loose ends. The harem was the heart of imperial power, and in the Ottoman world, the heart could never bleed in public. Even the sultans themselves were haunted by what they ordered. In private letters, some wrote of dreams filled with faceless women, whispering from the shadows. Others filled their nights with prayer and music, trying to drown out the echoes of the vanished. The palace musicians played softer songs in those days, as if even melody feared the truth. And yet, despite all this silence, the empire could never fully bury the past. Stories survived, whispered by servants, carried by traders, repeated by foreign travelers who caught glimpses of veiled women being led away. They spoke of women whose faces were never seen again, whose names vanished from the records, whose portraits were destroyed. Some said they haunted the palace gardens, appearing in mirrors or the ripples of fountains. The empire denied such tales, of course, but denials are often just another form of confession. The Ottomans called it order. Historians call it control. But to the women who lived through it, it was something else entirely: erasure. A life reduced to rumor. A memory rewritten by power. Every vanished concubine was a lesson to those who remained. You exist only as long as you are useful. And the moment you are not, the empire forgets you ever lived. Thus the harem remained perfect, flawless, elegant, untarnished, because every imperfection had already been removed. And for centuries, the empire's golden age glittered brightly on the surface, hiding beneath it the quietest genocide of memory the world has ever known. Inside the Ottoman harem, beauty was never enough. Power belonged not to the most beautiful, but to the most strategic. Behind every jeweled veil was a mind sharpened by fear, because survival here was not a right, it was an art. Every woman in the harem had two faces. One she showed the sultan, and one she kept hidden for the world of politics. And nowhere was that duality more dangerous than under the watchful eye of the valid sultan, the sultan's mother, the only woman who could command him and the harem alike. The valid sultan was both guardian and executioner. She decided which concubines would serve, which would rise, and which would be forgotten. Her word carried the weight of empire. To offend her was to vanish. To please her was to live for a while. Many of the disappearances that history attributes to the sultans were, in truth, orchestrated by the valid sultan. Her motives were rarely personal. They were political. The harem was not just a sanctuary, it was a breeding ground for heirs. And with every new child came new threats to the throne. If a concubine bore a son, she was no longer just a woman, she was the mother of a potential sultan. And that made her both powerful and dangerous. Her survival meant her child might one day rule. Her death meant that child's bloodline ended quietly before it could grow teeth. The valid sultan had lived long enough to know how fragile the throne could be. She had seen brothers kill brothers, sons kill fathers, cousins poison each other for a chance to wear the crown. She knew that too many heirs meant instability, and instability meant blood in the streets of Istanbul. So, the easiest solution was silence. When a concubine's son showed too much promise, or her influence grew too visible, she would simply vanish. Sometimes her child disappeared too, listed in court records as returned to God. To the empire, it was a necessary sacrifice. To the harem, it was a warning carved in silence. But jealousy, too, played its part, that old serpent that never slept inside the palace walls. The sultan's favorites watched each other constantly. Every gift, every sigh, every glance could turn into a spark of rivalry. And when jealousy and politics mixed, the results were deadly. A rumor whispered in the right ear could seal a woman's fate. She plotted against the valid sultan. She used sorcery to control the sultan's heart. She insulted the prophet's law. It didn't matter whether it was true in a palace of secrets. Perception was reality. By the time the accused concubine realized what had happened, her allies had already stepped back, afraid to share her shadow. And so, many disappearances were born not of the sultan's wrath, but of other women's ambition. The palace was a quiet battlefield. The weapons, charm, manipulation, flattery, and betrayal. Even the chief eunuch, the most powerful man within those walls, was caught in these silent wars. He served the sultan, but he also answered to the valid. He kept her secrets, enforced her will, and ensured that her chosen enemies were never seen again. One might ask, why didn't the sultan stop this? Why didn't he protect the women he once adored? The answer lies in the empire's philosophy, control above compassion. The sultan ruled not as a man, but as a symbol, and symbols do not show weakness. To grieve openly for a concubine was to admit attachment. Attachment was vulnerability, and in the Ottoman court, vulnerability could start a civil war. So, the sultan turned his face away. Sometimes he prayed. Sometimes he drowned his sorrow in the sound of music, or in the arms of another woman. And sometimes, he simply forgot. Forgetfulness was a privilege only the powerful could afford. The harem's hierarchy thus became an empire within an empire, one that consumed itself from within. Each disappearance created a ripple of fear that kept the others obedient. Each silence was a message. Stay beautiful, stay quiet, stay useful, or be erased. The result was an empire that looked stable from the outside, but inside, it rotted with secrets. Every palace intrigue, every court decision, every whispered death shaped Ottoman politics for centuries. Even ambassadors noticed it, writing that the women behind the curtain rule more than the men who wear the sword. And they were right, because in the end, the Ottoman harem wasn't ruled by the sultan's desire, it was ruled by fear and jealousy, polished to perfection and hidden behind the illusion of divine order. These weren't merely personal crimes, they were political necessities, justified in the name of stability. Every vanished concubine was another brick in the wall of imperial control. And though her name was lost, her silence helped build the image of an empire that could never admit to chaos. But chaos doesn't vanish when you bury it. It waits beneath the gold, beneath the silence, until the walls begin to whisper again. The Ottoman harem was the most secretive institution on earth. Its walls were tall, its doors heavy, its silence sacred, and within that silence moved a brotherhood of men unlike any others. The eunuchs, they were not born into power. They were made for it. Taken as boys from Africa, from Nubia and Abyssinia, they were brought to Istanbul, where their lives were rewritten. They were cut off from family, from freedom, and from the world of men. But inside those stone walls, they became something more than servants. They became the eyes, ears, and hands of the empire's deepest secrets. The chief black eunuch, known as the Kisler Akask, stood second only to the sultan's mother in influence. He held the keys to the harem. He knew every hidden passage, every sealed room, every whisper carried through silk curtains. And when a concubine's time was over, it was his men who carried out the will of power. To outsiders, the eunuchs seemed emotionless, silent, expressionless, loyal. But inside, they bore the weight of centuries of obedience. Each had seen more cruelty than most soldiers ever would. Each knew what happened when a woman's beauty became dangerous. When the sultan or valid sultan gave the signal, usually a single phrase, spoken in calm tones, the eunuchs would understand. They would not ask who or why. They would not record it. They would only act. Sometimes, the woman would be told she was being transferred to another palace, perhaps the old palace, where retired concubines lived. She would dress in her finest silk, thinking she was beginning a new chapter. To you, would escort her down the silent corridors, past the golden doors, past the scented gardens that once echoed with laughter. The path would change, the air would grow colder, and by the time she realized where she was being taken, the gate of felicity, her fate was sealed. The eunuchs did not speak. They did not look into her eyes. Their loyalty was absolute, their faces unreadable. They were instruments of order, not cruelty. But the result was the same. Silence swallowed another name. The chief eunuch would then return to his chamber, where a small record book awaited. No names were written, only symbols. A crescent meant completion. A star meant delay. A blank line meant silence. An act so secret even he could not speak of it again. For centuries, the eunuchs maintained the illusion that the harem was peaceful, controlled, and divine. But beneath that perfection was a system built entirely on their obedience. They were both victims and executioners, bound by the very system that had taken everything from them. Some tried to ease their guilt. Historical accounts tell of eunuchs who prayed for the souls of the women they escorted, whispering their names in the dark, even when forbidden. Others numbed themselves, believing that obedience was salvation, that their service bought redemption in the eyes of God. But the truth was more tragic. Many eunuchs grew old, forgotten in the very palace they once ruled, through fear and silence. When they died, few were buried with honor. Their graves lie near the outer walls of Topkapi Palace, small and unmarked. Each stone represents a man who had seen everything and spoken nothing. The eunuchs' loyalty shaped the entire Ottoman system. Without them, no order could be carried out in secrecy. Without them, the illusion of divine justice would collapse. Their silence was the foundation of imperial power. In whispers, some concubines even believed the eunuchs were cursed, men who could never love, never father, never disobey. They became symbols of the empire's dark trade, humanity for obedience. And that was the price every empire pays when it confuses control with strength. Their presence gave the sultan power, but it also made him distant from the world. The eunuchs' efficiency, their devotion, their fear, it all created a machine of rule that devoured empathy. Through them, cruelty became procedure, death became policy, and silence became the language of empire. Imagine it, the halls of Topkapi in the dead of night, oil lamps flickering, marble floors gleaming like cold water, and through the corridors, shadows glide, neither men nor ghosts, carrying out their unspoken duty. The world above sleeps, believing the empire divine. But beneath, history unfolds, not with the roar of armies, but with the quiet breath of obedience. And so, for every sultan who ruled the empire, there were hundreds of eunuchs who ruled his silence. They did not command armies, they commanded fear, and that fear was enough to hold one of the greatest empires in history together, until even that silence could no longer contain what it had buried. As the centuries passed, the Ottoman Empire stood like a titan between continents. Its armies conquered kingdoms, its scholars mapped the stars, its artists painted paradise on ceilings of gold. But within the palace walls, beneath the silken splendor, another kind of empire grew, one of ghosts. Every empire builds monuments to its victories. The Ottomans built mosques, fortresses, fountains, all to celebrate power. But there were no monuments for the discarded, no names carved in marble, no prayers whispered for those who vanished. When a concubine was removed, whether by order, jealousy, or politics, her body was rarely seen again. If she was fortunate, she was buried quietly in a small graveyard near the old palace, wrapped in silk, without a name. If she was less fortunate, she was sent into the sea. The Bosphorus, that glittering blue artery between east and west, carried many secrets. Fishermen whispered of bodies caught in their nets, veiled, bound, lifeless, marked by the delicate jewelry of the harem. But no one dared speak openly. To speak of such things was to invite the wrath of the sultan himself. And so, the water became the archive of the forbidden. Each wave carried away a story that could not be told. Each tide erased another trace of the empire's perfection. Inside the palace, the rooms of the vanished were cleansed and reassigned. Their belongings were redistributed. Even their portraits, if any existed, were painted over. To the next generation of concubines, they were nothing but a warning. Be loyal, be silent, be useful, or you, too, will become a whisper beneath the silk. The harem elders, old women who had survived decades of intrigue, sometimes spoke of a hidden chamber beneath Topkapi, a place where the most secret of burials took place. It was said that the walls were lined with marble, cold and wet, and the floors covered with fine sand to absorb sound. There, the concubines who could not be seen again were laid to rest, not as criminals, not as martyrs, but as secrets. No records exist. No historian ever found proof. But those who studied the palace architecture noticed strange sealed doorways, narrow halls that led nowhere, and spaces marked in plans but missing in reality. Perhaps they were or perhaps they were graves, silent, hidden beneath centuries of dust and denial. One chronicler from the 17th century wrote, "The harem breathes as a body does. What it cannot exhale, it buries within," and that is what the empire did. It buried its unwanted in layers of silence, so thick that even history forgot to ask questions. But sometimes, the silence breaks. During restoration works in the 19th century, laborers unearthed a section of marble flooring near the women's quarters. Beneath it, they found fragments of silk, a golden bracelet, and human bone. The discovery was quietly covered up. No one was punished because no one spoke. Today, tourists walk those same corridors. They marvel at the mosaics, the chandeliers, the fountains of the Sultan's court. They take photographs, smiling under the domes that once echoed with cries and whispers. But they do not know what lies beneath their feet. Every empire hides its shame beneath its glory. The Romans buried their slaves under their baths. The Chinese sealed their concubines within tombs. The Ottomans buried theirs in silk, as if gentleness could disguise cruelty. Yet, silk decays, and time, though patient, is merciless. The truth always rises, like air escaping from beneath the surface of the sea. The whispers of the past find their way into the world again, not through documents, but through stories like this one. The women of the harem were more than ornaments. They were dreamers, survivors, victims of beauty and power. And even though their names were erased, their silence shaped empires. Because nothing haunts power more than the memory of those it destroyed to exist. Buried in silk, forgotten in stone, but still, their stories breathe. The Ottoman Empire fell long ago. Its palaces stand as museums, its thrones as exhibits. But the women it consumed still live, not in flesh, but in the caution they left behind. Every golden room, every jeweled gate, is a reminder that no amount of beauty can hide the cost of cruelty forever. Stay until the final chapter, because now, we reveal how the ghosts of these women and the stories buried beneath Topkapi still echo today, and how their forgotten legacy shaped the downfall of the empire itself. For centuries, the harem remained untouchable, a realm of velvet secrets and golden chains. No man outside the Sultan's trust ever set foot beyond its gates. But what no empire can hide forever is the weight of its own sins. The Ottoman court had long prided itself on divine order, that every act, no matter how cruel, served a higher balance. But behind that perfection, cracks began to form. The ghosts of the discarded, those buried in silken silence, began to shape the living. It started subtly. Concubines whispered in corners, fearful yet defiant. Older women, the Khalfa and Usta, began to tell forbidden stories to the young, tales of those who vanished, not as warnings, but as truths. And truth is dangerous in a palace built on lies. Soon, the air inside the harem began to change. The younger concubines no longer believed in the promise of eternal glory. They saw the palace for what it was, a place where beauty could save you one day and destroy you the next. They learned to manipulate, to conspire, to survive not through obedience, but through information. And so began what historians later called the era of the harem queens. Valid sultans, mothers of the throne, started using their power not only to protect their sons, but to avenge the sisters the system had devoured. Some historians say these women, hardened by loss and cruelty, became more cunning than the sultans themselves. One name still stands out. Concubine Sultan, a woman of foreign birth, once a concubine herself, who rose to become the most powerful woman in Ottoman history. She had seen the empire's cruelty firsthand, seen women vanish without cause, their beauty turned into a weapon against them, and she vowed that under her reign, no woman would suffer unseen again. But even she could not escape the curse of the palace. Power, once touched, changes the soul. Her own sons were turned against her. Whispers filled the harem that the Sultan feared his mother's influence, and feared what she might reveal. In 1651, the unthinkable happened. Concubine Sultan, the woman who had once ruled the empire from behind the curtain, was strangled by the same silk cord used on the concubines she had tried to protect. Her death marked the turning point. From that moment, the harem was no longer seen as sacred. It was seen as dangerous. The empire had turned its cruelty upon itself. As decades passed, the eunuchs, the valid sultans, and the royal women all fought for control. The palace became a maze of rivalry and fear. Outside its walls, the world was changing. Revolutions, enlightenment, new ideas of freedom. But inside, the harem still played its old game of silence and obedience, until even the sultan could no longer bear its ghosts. By the 19th century, the Ottoman reformers, desperate to modernize, began dismantling the old systems. The harem, once the beating heart of imperial mystery, was slowly emptied. No more new concubines were brought in. The eunuchs were dismissed. The golden gates were locked. When the last of the Ottoman sultans left Topkapi Palace in 1924, he left behind more than just furniture and art. He left behind centuries of buried voices. And as the doors closed for the final time, the silence that had once protected the empire became its requiem. The empire fell, not because of war, but because it forgot the value of mercy. Those discarded women, their stories erased, their faces unknown, had shaped the empire's destiny in ways no general or vizier ever could. Their suffering created ripples, whispers that turned into revolts, grief that turned into vengeance, and silence that turned into history's loudest accusation. Today, historians uncover their fragments in diaries, letters, and Ottoman court records. Each line a ghostly reminder that power without empathy is its own poison. Their stories teach us that the cruelty of kings does not vanish. It seeps into every marble, every echo, every throne that follows. The fall of the Ottoman Empire was not the end of its women's story. It was their revenge. For the first time in centuries, their silence was broken, and the empire that silenced them was finally forced to listen. Empires are built by strength, but they are remembered by the way they treated the powerless. The Topkapi Palace still stands today, shimmering with gold, echoing with the laughter of tourists. But if you listen closely in the Hall of the Concubines, when the air is still and the light flickers across the marble floor, you can almost hear them, the whispers of those buried in silk, reminding us that no beauty, no empire, no glory, ever truly escapes the judgment of time.